Alex, can you talk a bit about how Balloongate has affected U.S. China decoupling in terms of supply chains and also key tech sectors?
Balloongate underscores the strategic competition that's taking place between China and the United States, and the fact that um, if this turns out to be a surveillance balloon, part of a larger surveillance program, that's a pretty aggressive program that Beijing would be running, and so that would indicate that Beijing is contemplating, or even more than contemplating, some kind of military confrontation with the U.S. in the future. So, given that, technology and strategic technology becomes very, very important to this debate about whether or not the U.S. and its allies should essentially decouple from China, certainly around supply chains involving technology transfer, technology investment in the strategic areas such as AI, supercomputing, navigation, robotics, biotech, and a host of other areas. So Balloongate, I think, is a barometer of this. It's a test, if you will, of the levels of tension and the levels of confrontation that we might see in the future.
But there's also conflicting figures in terms of total trade going up between the U.S. and China.
An additional $30 billion in Chinese exports to the United States in 2022, and a small jump in American exports to China, just under 2 billion, approximately around 2 billion. Um, I think that represents a couple of things. One is China's economy is opening up after COVID, and I think there were a lot of investments that American and other foreign companies had that were put on hold, and they've now gone ahead and started to move forward with those. So I think that's part of that surge. Um, the other is just the fact that American multinational companies and a lot of other foreign companies that have been embedded in China, that have been entangled in China in supply chains that link to China for decades now, they just find it very, very difficult to disentangle unless forced to do so. And so we are seeing that, as I mentioned earlier, in the tech sector, but we're not necessarily seeing it in a much broader, what I call a gray zone, a gray area, um, that may or may not become subject to decoupling in the future, depending on how relations unfold.
Alex, can you talk a bit about the gray zone?
I think there's a large section in that gray zone of what we call dual use technologies. And these are commercial applications of technology and consumer goods and so forth that could, in fact, be used or somehow applied for military purposes. And so, hence, they become dual use, meaning in some cases they require an export license, and in other cases they don't, just depending on who the buyer is and where the buyer is located. So there's a big chunk of that with this U.S. China trade and Europe China trade that's in that dual use gray zone. So if hostilities increase, if the relationship erodes further, then those things in that gray zone are going to be at risk of being blocked or banned.
Speaking of decoupling, there's also an interesting figure. Um, Chinese ownership of U.S. debt is at an all-time low.
I'll tell you what we shouldn't read from it, and that is that the Chinese are going to somehow weaponize all that debt and start dumping it. Right? I mean, that's been part of this narrative that's persisted for years. That Beijing holds such a huge chunk of U.S. Treasury bills that they could weaponize it by just essentially cutting it loose and dumping it in the markets. But they're not going to do that because it's going to hurt Chinese interests as much as anyone else's. To do that, um, you know, would wreak havoc with the currency, for example. And at this point, it's really important that the currency that I'm talking about, the renminbi, stays within a certain range of parameters to make their exports competitive, basically. So, as long as they're buying dollar denominated debt in large chunks, that's going to drive the value of the dollar up, and it's going to drive, vis-a-vis that transaction, is going to drive down the renminbi, which is good for exports, right? For Chinese exports.